first workshop. My name is Yasmin Ali. I'm a member of Stand Up to Racism in Manchester, and I'll be chairing today's session titled The Mainstream, the Media, and the Far Right, How Do We Stop Islamophobia? We've got a great plenary of speakers today that the meeting will run. They'll speak first for each around 5-6 minutes, and then we'll turn to discussions. In between you two, you have about 2-3 minutes to chat to the people next to you, and then we'll go into main discussion where you can raise your hand, make a contribution. We'll try to get as many people from the floor. So that's great. So now I'll start with our first speaker, who is Celsabil from MEND.
Hello, hello. How's everyone? I'm glad you're well. So my name is Hadh-Cherif, and I am the London Regional Manager at MEND. That stands for Muslim Engagement and Development. MEND is an organization that was founded in 2014, and it was created specifically for the purpose of tackling Islamophobia. That is our goal, and the way we do it is primarily through education, but also through lobbying, through encouraging Muslims to be more politically active, through encouraging them to engage with politics and media and to organize. So let's talk about Islamophobia, and let's start with the beginning. Let's talk about the challenges. Now, the first challenge we're facing, and it's quite interesting and crazy actually that we're still facing this challenge in 2024, is recognition. The battleground as it stands when it comes to Islamophobia right now is still at recognition in many instances, and with many parties and with many, political parties. We're still here arguing that Islamophobia does indeed exist. It does in fact affect people, and that is kind of quite a difficult arena to be in. So I think when we talk about the struggle for recognition of Islamophobia, we need to start at recognition, at recognizing that it exists. The second element of it is, what is Islamophobia, right? We need to understand it. We need to define it in order for us to know how to fight it. It is absolutely crucial that we do understand Islamophobia to be a form of racism, because that's what it is. It follows the structures of racism and in the historical processes at which we arrived at this point where Islamophobia is rife is through the same historical processes that led to racism. Now, let me explain. Islamophobia is not just a collection of individual instances of abuse or individual instances of attacks and so on. It's actually a system. It's an ideology. And the ideology stems from, no surprise, Orientalism, right? Orientalism was all about creating this other, right? The Eastern other that justified the brutalization and the colonization and the oppression of the East. Right. And that was done in order to exploit them and make more money. So capitalism seems to be the root of all evils, as always. So when you understand Islamophobia through that lens and through that framework, you arrive at an accurate representation of what it is, right? It's the demonization of Muslims specifically because they happen to be the most convenient other to target at the moment. And these changes, we arrived at this point through several processes. You start, to be honest with you, if you were to go through a historical analysis, you could actually start at the Crusades and this otherization in order to dominate plays out throughout. And the most recent sort of watershed moment we had in the development of modern Islamophobia is, of course, 9/11. Now let's talk about proof. At MEND, we have a session called The Causes, Cures, and Islamophobia, and in it, we talk about proof that Islamophobia exists. We need to prove it. So we have a number of statistics, how difficult it is to get a job if you have a Muslim-sounding name, difficulty of access, and then you have more horrendous examples, such as the attacks in Leicester. You have the attack on Zainab Hussein in Leicester, who was run over. You have the killing of Mohammed Ali in Finsbury Park Mosque. Now, these are all examples that show the extent to which it can get and how bad it can get. But really, right now, we have been witnessing a genocide that has been going on for over a year. And that genocide has been primarily justified through the use of Islamophobic rhetoric. A lot of the time we look at ourselves or we look at the media and think, how can an 11-story building in Beirut be bombed and there not be outrage everywhere across the board? The answer to that is the media has manufactured consent for you to see that kind of thing, for all of us to witness that kind of thing through Islamophobic rhetoric. We absolutely do not need more proof that Islamophobia exists besides the fact that you can carry out a genocide against Muslims, justify it through the use of Islamophobic rhetoric by calling them terrorists, prone to terror, inherently violent, otherizing them in that way, and get away with it again and again and again. That is your proof. That is our proof. And I don't think we need any more than that. And then when we think of day-to-day Islamophobia, where we are right here, of course, you know, national policies, foreign policies affect all of us. The fact that we're witnessing this is a state of mind, and it will affect every single one of us for decades to come. But the other element to this, is actually how Muslims can advocate for themselves, and this is a big thing. Islamophobia, watching it, witnessing it play out on this scale is one thing, but the difficulty that Islamophobic policies present when it comes to Muslims advocating for themselves is a different part of this discussion. And I think there needs to be a serious discussion about Islamophobia in activism, because you can see across the board students being targeted at every level, from primary schools to universities, for advocating for themselves and for speaking about Palestine. And so what we need to think about is how we can build broad coalitions where we recognize the interconnectedness of all the struggles, of all our struggles against racism, and work together to build a broader coalition where it is far more difficult to divide and conquer and to separate and to otherize a section of society that are just trying to advocate for themselves. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Celsabil. Our next speaker will be Mohammed Kozbar, who is the Deputy Secretary General of the Muslim Council of Britain.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone. Just want to start with the last Wednesday during the Prime Minister question time. He was asked about how this government will be tackling or what this government has done to tackle Islamophobia. And his reply was that any sort of racism, including Islamophobia, has no place in our country and in our society, which is good to hear from the Prime Minister. But I just wanted to ask about these words. If this word has weight with the Prime Minister, with his government, or his party? Because as Muslims, we fed up with words. We need actions, and we didn't see any action so far from this government. The fact is that 40% of the religious hate crime is toward Muslims. The fact is that Islamophobia has increased just only last year, 360%. And it is an increase, still it is an increase. The fact is, we witnessed all the riots which took place during the summer. We've seen how these hatred marches, and we have to call it hatred marches. It's not the marches which ask for peace and to stop genocide in Palestine is the hatred marches. These are the hatred marches which targeted Muslims in the streets, mosques and businesses being attacked and vandalized. These are the hatred marches, and we have to call it as it is. What we need from the Prime Minister and his government is actions, serious actions, not words. And therefore, there is 4 questions I would like to ask the Prime Minister about. The first one, if this government really care about tackling Islamophobia, why it doesn't adopt the APPG definition of Islamophobia until now, despite that the Labour government, the Labour Party adopted the definition few years ago. And this government represents the Labour Party. Why so far they didn't adopt the APPG definition, which is a definition accepted by the Muslim community and also parliamentarians across parties. If this government is serious about tackling Islamophobia, why are they not engaging with the biggest Muslim umbrella organization like MCB, the Muslim Council of Britain? We are not here begging the government. We are here to ask about our rights as a Muslim community, to be represented, to be in the table when the Muslim community being discussed. They are engaging with small organizations, represent themselves. That does not give them the right to say that they are engaging with the Muslim community. If this government is serious about tackling Islamophobia, why they are not discussing the issues of concerns of the Muslim community? And in the top of it, the genocide which is taking place in Gaza, where we've seen millions of people from the Muslim community and from the wider society marches throughout the whole year, last year's, demanding this government to call for a ceasefire and to stop arming Israel. They ignored all these demands and continue to support Israel in its genocide in Gaza. If this government is serious about tackling Islamophobia, why it doesn't deal with institutional and normalizations of Islamophobia in the society, including the media, where false and negative news were spread about Muslims. The Central for Media and Monitoring, the CFMM, sends correction to different media outlets almost on a daily basis, asking them to correct wrong information about Muslims, whether it is provocative titles or inappropriate pictures or wrong information about Muslims. Many of them ignored the request, and even when they agreed to make the correction, the damage has done. So there's nothing can be done about it more than that. Smearing and discrediting Muslim leaders and Muslim organizations to make it difficult for them to engage with others, like political parties, faith organizations, police, and so on. And the list can go on and on and on. Even in the political parties like the Labour Party and the Conservative Party, where many Muslim members experienced Islamophobia and discriminations against. It is normal now to hear about incidents here and there, and no action has been taken as nothing happened. Islamophobia has been normalized, unfortunately, within the society, and we should stop that. We are the people who can stop that. Finally, tackling Islamophobia is not by words, but by actions. And unless this government show the Muslim community and the majority of the British people that serious actions are taken, no one will take these words seriously. And the mistrust and the lack of confidence with this government will continue. This is why we have a very, dear brothers and sisters, ladies and gentlemen, we have a very tough and difficult and challenging time ahead with the Trump being elected in the United States, and we've heard the speakers, what they said about it. And therefore, let us continue the struggle and keep the pressure until justice and fairness prevail. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mohammed. Our third speaker will be Shabir from Stop the War.
Greetings, comrades. I'll try not to repeat what the previous two speakers have said too much. For 2.5 decades, Islamophobia has been the predominant form of racism across the West. And this is not about a hierarchy of racisms, but it's about understanding that racism is a function of power and it is driven by the state. And for the last 2.5 decades, the British state, as other Western states, have primarily manufactured Islamophobia. And the reason for this is that in 2001, to launch their so-called war on terror, to carry out their devastating wars in the Middle East, and in a bid to maintain their imperial domination of the world, they necessarily had to demonize Muslims that they were bombing. To defend those deeply unpopular wars and crush the dissent against them, of which Muslims were at the forefront of, they had to create a suspect community out of Muslims at home. And to then scapegoat for their austerity policies and for the consequences of those wars, they demonized the refugees that were produced by those wars. And they did this through their racist rhetoric, like Tony Blair saying that Muslims are not compatible with modern society, like Theresa May's go home vans, like Boris Johnson calling Muslim women letterboxes and bank robbers, through their racialized and completely incorrect narrative around grooming gangs. And they did it structurally through the passing of legislation like the anti-terror laws, which gave extraordinary powers to the police to stop and detain Muslims without reasonable suspicion, through policies like Prevent, which have all but ended free speech in public institutions. And the media is the uncritical mouthpiece of the state, which proudly propagates its lies and platforms the racists and the liars. And it's why Nigel Farage has had the most airtime of any politician long before he ever set foot in Parliament. The truth is that Islamophobia has become the acceptable and respectable form of racism, such that the likes of Marine Le Pen in France can pose as not a fascist. And it is this Islamophobic basis that becomes the main talking points and avenues for organization of the far right and fascist movements. And there is a direct conveyor belt from the state to the fascists on the streets. An example of this is in 2014, David Cameron at the Dispatch Box said that universities had become hotbeds of Islamic extremism. The next day, it was on the front pages of the media, and a week later, the English Defence League, led by Tommy Robinson, had organized protests to disrupt Muslims on campuses. And this summer's fascist Islamophobic pogroms were the culmination of this same process. Last year, Suella Braverman, then Home Secretary, called our protests hate marches, our protests for Palestine. On Remembrance Day, on Armistice Day rather, when we had our demonstration, she directly mobilized the fascists to come and defend monuments. And she talked about two-tier policing, as if the police treat Palestine protesters better. And that became the slogan that Tommy Robinson then used on his demonstration in July, where the other rallying call that he made was to fly British flags on British streets instead of Palestinian ones. Those of us who have been active in the Palestine movement for years have long seen the alliance between fascists and Zionists. We've long seen the counter-protests which have pro-Israeli protesters and Britain first. And there's a simple reason for this. Zionism is racism, simple and plain. It is not an abstract debate on Jewish self-determination as it was over a century ago. It is realized in the state of Israel as an apartheid genocidal state. And it's why the fascists identify with Israel as an ethnocratic segregated state and recognize its role as a central plank of Western imperialism that is defending the Western Empire against the rest of the world and particularly Muslims. So we cannot have an anti-racist movement here which is neutral on the question of Palestine and opposing racist genocide, just as you could not have a coherent anti-fascist movement against the National Front in the 70s that was neutral on the question of apartheid South Africa, just as the civil rights movement in the US in the 60s became stronger when it took up the mantle of opposing the Vietnam War. Malcolm X said, If you're not careful, the newspapers will have you loving the oppressors and hating the oppressed. And that is exactly what they are trying to do. It's why those of us who march against racist genocide are called hate marchers, and Tommy Robinson's thugs were called pro-British protesters. Is how they can weaponize anti-Semitism so that racist Israelis in Amsterdam attacking Muslims and chanting death to Arabs are suddenly victims of pogroms. So we cannot let them divide our movement. And if we are in the business of building the broadest, most united movement against the fascists, then the vast majority of the people in this country oppose the genocide in Palestine, oppose the arming of Israel. And we have to link up these fights and ensure that the Palestine movement, which today, 13 months on, is still the biggest, most organized and most persistent social force that we have in society, is a central part of the fight against fascism, the far right, and in confronting Islamophobia head on. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Shabir. Our last and final speaker will be Samira Ali, who is the Stand Up to Racism National Organiser.
Thanks, everyone. Look, I'm going to try and keep it brief because I know we've already cut into this session, and I think we really want people to be able to discuss amongst ourselves and talk about how we are actually getting organized to oppose Islamophobia. And I think this session comes at a very crucial time, but also particularly in Islamophobia Awareness Month. It is really crucial that we are raising these things. Okay, but I want to start by talking about someone that people might have heard of called Pete Hegseth. He's a far-right commentator. He has a Fox News show. People might have heard of him. He's an ex-soldier, in the US's bloody wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. He's also had a stint in Guantanamo Bay, which obviously has locked up Muslims as so-called terrorists for decades. He wrote a book in 2020 called The American Crusade, which said that Muslims were infiltrating US society. He said that Muslims were replacing native citizens in what he called a cultural invasion. He said that Islam was a religion of destruction and terror. Muslim countries are a no-go zone for Christians and Jews, and so on. And he also said that Christians may need to arm themselves against said so-called Muslim invasion. Okay, well, why am I telling you all these awful racist lies? I'm saying this because this is the person that Donald Trump has just appointed as Secretary of Defense in the US. He is the person that will be the chief of the Pentagon in the biggest power in the world. And he's not just a vile Islamophobe. He's, belongs to the far right, obviously. He's been investigated for sexual assault, has white nationalist tattoos, thinks women and LGBT people shouldn't be allowed into the army, and so on. And Trump is actually busy since his election, himself being a supreme Islamophobe whose policies before have been imposing the Muslim ban and so on, but he is busy appointing these far-right figures into his cabinet. His vice president, obviously J.D. Vance, who since he was announced as vice president, one of the first things he said was Britain was now the first Islamist-run country. Obviously something that Braverman has also said. But how have we got here? Obviously, around the world, with the far right are on the rise, and Islamophobia is the cornerstone of all of their politics, from Le Pen in France to Nigel Farage here in Britain to Meloni and in Italy and Trump in the US. But I think there will be a lot of discussion about the far right at this summit, but I want to talk about the fact it's not just this far right, is it? Who is it that said stop the boats? Who is it who spoke about Islamists in control of Britain or called Palestine marches hate marches? This was the Tory party. This was the so-called mainstream politicians and parties, not to mention obviously the decades like Shabir spoke about of Tony Blair and successive leaders, pushing out Islamophobia and attacks on Muslims. Time and time again, mainstream politicians and parties have entrenched and normalized Islamophobia. It's the anti-Muslim rhetoric, but it's also the policies. Islamophobia has come codified across Europe. with policies obviously like Prevent here in Britain, which wants to label all Muslims as terrorists at bay, or in France with the hijab bans, which say that women do not have a choice in what they would like to wear. We oppose this. We say from Iran to France, women have the right to wear what they choose. And in France, the constant concessions to Islamophobia by mainstream politicians, especially from Macron, but right across the mainstream politics, the political spectrum, has led right to the rise of Marine Le Pen, who could be France's next prime minister. And the same dangers could happen here. Keir Starmer, when we talk about Keir Starmer, we have to say that he must stop making concessions to racism. He must stop making concessions to Islamophobia. Mohammed spoke about that we need a prime minister that is challenging Islamophobia. We don't just want empty words. During the riots, Keir Starmer was able to come out to condemn the violence. He was able to call the riots far right. But he didn't go as far as to call them Islamophobic, because then maybe he would have to look at his own position and what this government is doing in attacking Muslims. But this is also leading to, when we think about, what Starmer and the Labour Party and what we must be telling them to do. We cannot allow Nigel Farage to legitimise himself when he talks about Muslims not sharing British values and the rest of it. Okay, 1 minute. So I want to talk about how we actually fight Islamophobia. I think we have to start by saying that we can make no concessions. You do not fight racism by making concessions to it. There is no such thing as good or bad Muslims. We have to come out and say these things. We have to come out and say these things loudly. If you give Islamophobia an inch, the far right will take a mile. So the anti-racist movement must be absolutely steadfast in opposing Islamophobia. And we have to understand what we're up against, because people have spoke about Islamophobia going back to 9/11, but I think it goes back further than that, actually to the Iranian Revolution in 1979, where Islamophobia was, used to demonize a movement which was challenging US imperialism. And that's why today, when you see Muslims leading a Palestine movement and marches on the streets of Britain, that they are demonized with Islamophobic lies of being so-called terrorists, hate marchers, anti-Semites, and the rest of it. But we also know that racism serves our leaders here to scapegoat out of the ills of society. People like Nigel Farage, who try to put the blame on Muslims, migrants, and refugees. He needs to be putting the blame on himself and his billionaire friends in the Reform Party. Okay, so just to end, I think when we're talking about how we stop Islamophobia, let's look at the mass movement, the mass anti-racist movement that halted the Islamophobic riots in August. At the start of those riots, obviously whipped up around an Islamophobic lie, whipped up by Islamophobes like Tommy Robinson, fascists like Tommy Robinson, who I haven't even managed to speak about in this session. He's behind bars, but we know the threat hasn't gone away. But at the start of those riots, I started with, an awful attack in Southport, but the next day, the far right threatened to attack a mosque in Liverpool, actually a mosque that I have a great connection to, something that my grandfather was involved in re-establishing. It was actually the first mosque in Britain, and the irony is lost on the far right, but it was set up by a white English convert to Islam over 100 years ago or so on. But when the far right put out the call that mosque was to be attacked, we could have seen the scenes of Southport again, but actually hundreds of people came out from Liverpool to defend that mosque from all walks of life, and we didn't know what we'd be walking into. We could have been walking into a riot, but people actually came out, and that's what gave everyone else the confidence to come out in their thousands in August to oppose the riots. And actually, it's important that we confront the far right wherever they are, but we call out their Islamophobia. We are specifically anti-racist in our politics. We say that refugees are welcome and the rest of it. But just to end, we know that the race is on, the far right is on the rise, and we need to build a movement of unity that brings in the maximum amount of people to oppose racism, a mass movement that takes on the far right, but also takes on state racism that is fueling them. And I'll stop there.
Thank you so much to all our speakers. I'm now going to hand it over to you. Discuss with the people next to you for around 2-3 minutes about what you're going to think about in your intervention. How can we stop Islamophobia? And then I'll bring you all back for discussion.
Yeah, that's fine. Next week is probably the last.
Hello, sorry. If you can stop your discussions, please. Hello. Thank you, thank you. Sorry to cut the discussion short. I'm sure you're all having great discussions, but due to the lack of time and I want to hear from as many people as possible, we're going to start the discussion now. So if anyone would like to ask a question or make a contribution, I'm going to time you all to keep it to 3 minutes. If you just raise your hand, there's people in high vis going around. So the first person that I'll go to is right in the front in the here.
Sometimes you pass.
Maybe come up to the stand.
Hello.
Hello? Okay, there we go. You can hear me. All right. So what I'm going to say is just what I've noted down and what I've been also feeling these past few months, especially from August. Islamophobia has risen at insane rates ever since August and those hate marches. These racists have become too comfortable because of the election, because of people like Tommy Robinson and Nigel Farage, because of the Palestinian liberation movement. Even today, with people, these Islamophobic rats who are outside today saying that there was no genocide in Gaza, once we all know there is. Over 200,000 are dead, murdered, or under the rubble because of Israel, because of the genocide, because of Zionism, right? So what I have to say is we have to fight against this. We can't keep on letting Islamophobia, sorry, we can't keep on letting Islamophobia run our country. We should be able to practice our religion. Even any religion, we should be able to practice it. That's all I had to say, but thank you.
I'll go to the comrade in the back, followed by the comrade in the purple hair next. Or if you can come up to the front, please. And if the next speaker could get ready by coming up to the front as well, so we can have a fast discussion.
Thank you, Comrade Chair. I think, comrades, it is impossible to exaggerate the threat that we now face in Britain today. The truth is that when Robinson has marched twice now, once with 25,000 people another time with 20,000 people. That is a serious base for the future for him. When Nigel Farage looked at the riots perpetrated by Robinson's demonstrations, what did he say? He said, all I know is that something horrible is happening to this once beautiful country of ours. That is not so much a dog whistle, but a foghorn calling the racists to come to his side. And therefore, when we hear the speakers on the platform emphasizing how Islamophobia is a central issue, of course, we are all against anti-Semitism. We're against all forms of racism. But comrades, we have to recognize that Islamophobia is the driving force, not only of the fascists and the right wing, but of the Tory party. And I'm sorry to say it, the disgraceful behavior of Yvette Cooper and Keir Starmer, who are fanning the same flames. And therefore, the response of Stand Up to Racism and a multitude of other organizations on October the 26th was immensely important because it has set the agenda and sending a message to every time there is a Reform UK candidate, every time Robinson tries to organize, we will be there. We will be confronting them on the streets, not necessarily with a physical confrontation, but a confrontation of overwhelming numbers. We outnumbered Robinson on the 26th, and the challenges ahead of us are absolutely huge. One final point. Everybody in this room will know that Islamophobia is a present threat. And the way in which Robinson, at his demonstration, in the first demonstration, Trafalgar Square, opened his rally by saying, there are no Palestinian flags here. Isn't that good? That is using Palestine to push Islamophobia. And I think our message is absolutely clear. We need unity, not only in the trade unions, but in the environmental organizations, in the women's organizations, in the gay organizations, and so on. But fighting Islamophobia is not just to be left to Muslims. It is the responsibility of every single person. It is the responsibility of every single person, whatever their ethnicity, whatever their sexual orientation, whatever their other political views is, it is our responsibility, because in the end, we're going to need unity, not just to defeat the fascists, but unity to fight one of the main recruiting sergeants to the Reform UK, which I'm sorry to say is Keir Starmer's government.
Thanks. I'll go to the person with the red hair.
Hello, is this working? Can you hear me? Yeah. I'm going to try to keep this brief, but I think we need to look at where we've come from. In 1936, someone from the Conservative Party suggested that there are consisting of Winston Churchill and in coalition with Oswald Mosley, who I'm sure everyone knows who that is, and Lord Beaverbrook, who at the time was the editor of the Daily Mail. And they said that ultimately they would like that for that to be a government of national unity with no opposition. This was in 1936 when Clement Attlee was a member of Parliament for Stepney. So I think we need to look at the fact that we've been here before and we defeated that threat before. So if we did it before, we can certainly try to do it again, and certainly hopefully succeed at doing that again for this generation and future generations. But I think this threat is always going to come back to bite us every so often, because this is 1936, here we are 2024, we're still having the same conversation about the same type of threat. I do actually have a question though, and it might be a very naive question, but my question is, why, I mean, I was talking to a lady next to me who used to work and still does work for the BBC, and she said that there are rows within the BBC regarding broadcasting in terms of the BBC's bias. Well, let's face it, we all know the BBC are biased. So I'd like to know, what do the media stand to gain from having such a right-wing bias? I know that the papers are owned by billionaires, but why is it that it seems that most, if not all, of the mainstream media seems to be in collusion with Islamophobia? I'd like to know what they stand to gain from it. Thank you.
Thank you. After will be Hussein at the back. Yeah.
All right, thank you. I'm born in Baghdad in Iraq, so the dehumanization of Arabs and of Muslims has been a feature of my life. You know, the very idea that Muslims are, I mean, you hear it all the time, men of fighting age coming to our shores. You know, Islamophobia, as speakers have said, it links all of these, you know, the far right, the racists, those in government, because it very clearly says one thing, that there's an invasion. And these ideas of you know, anti-refugee rhetoric link so acutely with Islamophobia. Because what they're saying is that Muslims are coming here, as Samira said, Muslims are coming here, that there's a culture war, they're coming to take our place. And I think this links incredibly pro-refugee. We need to be arguing that these crises that they talk about are not crises. Number one, whose crisis? The crisis of who? Of the racists. That their border systems and their racism is being shown to be man-made, to be a complete joke. The actual refugee crises that are happening are because we were there. Because we bombed Iraq, because we went into Afghanistan, because we are the ones funding genocide in Palestine. That is why these refugee crises happen. And we need to be really strong on that. And we need to show that what's happened with Farage and what's happening with the far right in the growth of the far right, that we're stronger together. And this is a very basic point. But it's a point we need to be really, really strong on. This isn't, like people said, that a fight for just Muslims, but we also need to be getting in the communities, talking to Muslims, talking, you know, as you know, many of us are Muslim, going into mosques, talking to community leaders, saying that we support you and we want you to join us in our solidarity with you. Because there was an element when the far right, you know, that exploded with the race riots, there was an argument about community self-defense, that Muslims just need to come out and need to basically, a group of Muslims need to fight and show that they're stronger than the fascists. Okay, sure, that works in small number of instances. It's if that whole mosque congregation, whatever you want to call it, all those people in the mosques come out in support, in solidarity, all the other people come to join them, and we say in our masses that the Muslims in our communities are our communities. They are part of us. We are one. They are us. And we need to say that. We cannot say that Muslims need to deal with them themselves, but equally we cannot also fall into the trap that community self-defense is what's needed. In reality, a mass movement of, you know, trade unions, community leaders, you know, etc., need to join together to say we do not stand for racism, we do not stand for anti-refugee rhetoric, and we are stronger together. Thank you.
Thank you. Sorry, there's been many people putting their hand up, so if I can just get everyone to put their hand up one more time so I can see who's visual. Obviously, I can't call everyone. Very sorry, but I'll go to the person in the Palestine badge. Oh, you didn't want to say anything? Okay, that's fine. I'll go to the person in the front first.
We need to tackle the institutions and organisations that, when they say that institutional racism does not exist, it still exists. I work in a university and I'm appalled at the way that the universities run the mechanisms, and I'm from Sheffield, I'm still the only one of the BAME, whatever you might call it, person on the ground. So what I say is that please empower yourself, get to play the game, get to that hierarchy. I did an LLB, LPC. I was going to go and become a solicitor. Is this recorded? No, because my son is locked up for 35 years under joint enterprise. He got locked up at 18. And I am fighting the organisations, the lawmakers the people at the top, the politicians, because they are talking a lot of crap about justice, and we're all fighting for justice. We're all fighting for human rights. Islamophobia was created to divide us all, and to divided we stand. What is this? What's the saying? United we stand, divided we rule. That's
Thank you. I'll go to the person directly behind there. Yes.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah.
No. Should I go up to the front or just shout? All right. Testing, testing, 1, 2, 3. Yeah. Okay. I'll be quick. I just wanted to. I was going to say something, but I completely changed my mind because someone asked earlier about how does the media gain from parroting this like racist Islamophobic propaganda. I think it's a, and I think we should try and answer it. So I'll have a go. I think you've got to look at the same reason why the state does it, right? Why does the state? Why do the politicians, like the speaker before me was saying, constantly say all this excellent input crap about Muslims and all of this Islamophobia? It's to keep us divided, right? And it also helps justify, manufactures consent for the horrible things that the state either enacts or has complicity in across the world, like with the most salient example at the moment, Palestine. How do you not have a complete uprising across Britain in response to what's going on in Gaza? You manufacture and you drive an atmosphere of casual Islamophobia, and you dehumanize Muslims as people who can't be genocided, right? Because we're not really meant to think of them as people. And I think the media does that for the same reason, because just like the government isn't really our friend. It sort of works for, as again, speaking before me was saying, people at the top, the super rich politicians. So does the media. The media is owned by incredibly rich, incredibly powerful people, and it generally tries to parrot the same line as the state. And I think that's the reason why. And I'll stop there so other people can speak.
Thank you so much. Unfortunately, that's all we have time for. I'm so sorry. There was plenty of hands up, and even those hands online, but we just couldn't get round to everyone, and we need to have our speakers come back. So I'm going to bring back Celsabil for about 2 minutes.
Sure. Actually, I think the media question is a good one and an interesting one. There was a recent article actually in Navarra. I'm going to say this really, really quickly, talking about the Guardian, right, and how the censoring of Susanna Bulhawa when she wanted to write an article. She was commissioned to write a piece, and she used what was the description of Holocaust for what was happening in Gaza. Now, this is an accurate description, and yet it was stopped by the Guardian, and Navarra covered this. And there was a really interesting sentence I read in that, and it was talking about the Guardian's editor-in-chief, global editor-in-chief, Fina. And it said she's really prone to influence and specifically afraid of embarrassment. So that actually makes us think, and it's a point of reflection. The state, there are very few political state actors that are ideologically motivated. We have one in the building with us right now. Jeremy Corbyn is an example of a politician who is actually motivated ideologically, who has an ideology he follows and actually cares about. The vast majority of politicians do not. They just follow what is dictated to them through power and influence. And the real challenge is, how does the right side, by right I don't mean like ideologically right, but correct, but the fair, the just side, gain that level of power and influence to be able to dictate what the politicians and the media produce, because that's what it comes down to. The reason she didn't want to publish that specific wording, and in the end the piece that was commissioned was pulled, was because she was afraid of how the Zionist lobby would then react to that type of reporting. We saw it with the Sky News reporting recently, the fact that they were forced to change their language. So it's about building a base, a base of power that is powerful enough to have the same effect. And to do that, we need to operate at every level, right? We need to think about media, we need to think about politics, we need to think about education, we need to think about protests, we need to think about lobbying. And only through building a coalition that addresses every level of this will we actually be successful at creating this change? Because politicians at their very, very core are only interested in power and the vehicles that allow them to gain that power. Now, because we are a lot more in mass, I think a good place to start actually is cultural change. And we can do that through education. That is entirely within our reach, outside of things like lobbying, which, you know, requires a bit more money and means. So yeah, that's what I'm going to end on, cultural change.
Thank you. Now I'll hand over to Mohammed for around 2 minutes.
Yeah, well, I'm really glad that we are all in the same line and we are talking the same things. Actually, the feeling that Islamophobia now is a huge issue which we all need to address and tackle is very important. Someone said that Islamophobia is not just only a Muslim issue; it's it's everybody's issue, and now Muslims are targeted. We don't know who will be tomorrow, who will be next. And if we go back to the history, we've seen how Jewish people being targeted, black people targeted, Irish people being targeted, and now it's Muslims. So it is everybody's issue, and we have really to work all together. And this is why it's very important to work together and to. We have a movement, but we need to make it more stronger and more organized. We have a huge movement, but as someone said, it has to be more organized and more, trying to reach out to different people. A lot of people here in this country, they oppose racism and Islamophobia, but we are not reaching to them. We are not trying to engage with them in a proper way. And that's why it's a big responsibility on all of us really to do that. As we said, challenges, difficulties, tough time is ahead of us, at least for the next 4 years. And we really need to do a lot of work together to make sure that at least we can stand together and challenge those who try to smear us and spread hatred, fear, and division among us. So yes, this is the beginning, but I hope I'm really optimistic that this is something which we can achieve in the future. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. I thought those were some very excellent contributions. I just want to come back on a couple of things. Someone mentioned the use of the language of men of fighting age around refugees. And this stems from Obama when he first became president. One of the first things he did was change the US's rules of engagement in war zones such that any man between the ages of 18 to 65 automatically is deemed a militant. And it's that practice which is carried on by the US and now in Israel, as we're seeing, any man in Gaza is a Hamas militant, and also in the rhetoric used around refugees and part of that Islamophobic narrative. Secondly, on the point about the media, I think what someone said is absolutely right. I think the media reflect state interests. That's what it is. And there is an intricate way that they do this. You can see the revolving door between the heads of the BBC and the government and, that kind of relationship they have. Over the last year, we've seen what's happened to reporters who've tried to break that narrative. There was a Sky News reporter who dared to question the Israeli envoy. She was sacked. There is also, as media workers have signed an open letter who have said, there is a massive culture of fear through the use of Prevent, where people can be reported for terrorism offenses over that. I'll just end with a couple of quick things. Just to give you an example of how the Islamophobia and what is going on in Palestine is linked and the dangerous situation we're in, is openly talked about in Germany and by the failed conservative leadership candidate Robert Jenrick, that Muslims should have to sign a loyalty pledge to Israel. That is the level of where we are at. And it's extremely dangerous and it has to be fought against. And the fight against Islamophobia, against imperialism, and for Palestine are one and the same. And we have to be united and we have to be organized. So I'll just end with a plug to say tomorrow Stop the War has an anti-war convention, is where we can discuss the analysis of these things and the strategy of how we can build our movement stronger. And on the 28th of November, there is a National Workplace Day of Action. Get involved, because if we build a fight for Palestine in workplaces and through our trade unions, the politicization and the confidence that comes with that will be necessary to fight against fascism and racism and everything else as well. Thanks.
Thank you. Now I'll hand it over to Samira to finish off for 2 minutes.
Okay. All right, thanks everyone. Yeah, I will keep it very brief because I know I ran over, but I just want to echo what others have said about the fight against Islamophobia that cannot be left to Muslims alone. And actually, if you think about every fight back in this country, if you think about the anti-war movement, if you think about the anti-racist movement over the years, Muslims have been at the heart of that and as the leadership of those movements. But also, Muslims are not just concerned with foreign policy or fighting racism, they are active members of the working class and struggle in this country. And, you know, to fight against the kind of despair which allows the far right and fascists to breed. So we need to build a mass united movement actually against Islamophobia. We need to bring in the maximum amount of people. We need to reach the maximum amount of people, like Mohammed was saying, to be a part of that movement. That is an active movement that is on the streets, but is a deep movement in every community. But we can take that movement into every workplace, into every school, onto every campus, and the rest of it. And the reality is that Muslims have always struggled against imperialism, against racism in this country and so on. But now, to beat Islamophobia, we need to bring in a mass and united movement to do so. And I think we have to say that we cannot rely on mainstream parties, mainstream politicians, everyone has said it, to beat Islamophobia. We know that they will make concessions to racism, they will push out austerity that actually allows for the far right to build. Time and time again, that movement is left to us, it is left to the thousands that mobilised in August, it is left to the 20,000 that mobilised against Tommy Robinson on the 26th of October. Every single person in this room has a massive part to play in beating Islamophobia and creating the kind of movement that can actually take on the threat of the far right, because it is a big one, but we know that we can beat them when we're united and when we're together.
Thank you so much to everyone for coming for this workshop, and sorry again for people that didn't get called. Obviously, it was very tight and we were running out of time, but you now have 20 minutes for lunch, and then we'll be back in the main hall for A Woman Like Me book launch with Diane Abbott. Thank you.